Picture this. It's Super Bowl Sunday. The entire office has been buzzing for 2 weeks. Your coworker printed a bracket, someone brought a jersey to work on Friday. The group chat is exploding with predictions, statistics, player injuries, and arguments about things that happened in games from 1987. And there you are, genuinely trying to care, nodding along, saying, yeah, that was a great play, about something you didn't watch, didn't follow, and honestly, didn't miss. You're not angry about sports. You're not trying to be difficult. You just don't feel it. And somehow that makes you feel like you're missing a chromosome that everyone else got. Here's what's fascinating, though. The psychology behind people who simply don't obsess over sports is not what most people assume. It's not apathy. It's not antisocial behavior. It's not even a lack of passion. In fact, some of the most emotionally intense, deeply loyal, and community-oriented people on Earth are people who couldn't name a single player on their local team. So what's actually going on inside the minds of people who just opt out of sports culture? What does neuroscience, personality psychology, and behavioral research actually say about this group? Because it turns out the answer is far more interesting than they're just not into it. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of why some brains latch onto sports and others don't begins way earlier than you might think. It begins in childhood, and it begins with something psychologists call identity formation through external anchors. When we're young, we are essentially walking bundles of undeveloped identity. We don't know who we are yet, so we look outward. We attach to things, teams, characters, music, anything that gives us a sense of belonging and self-definition. For millions of kids, sports becomes that anchor. A child watches their father lose his mind over a touchdown, feels the electric energy of a stadium, understands that cheering for this team means belonging to this family, this neighborhood, this tribe. That emotional imprinting is powerful. It becomes wired in. But not every child gets that imprinting. Maybe sports wasn't celebrated in their home. Maybe they were drawn to books, or art, or music, or animals, or building things. Maybe they tried organized sports and found the competitive, hierarchical structure uncomfortable rather than thrilling. And here's the key thing that researchers in developmental psychology have observed. The identity anchors we form early in life tend to persist. The things we attach to as children become the things we keep returning to as adults. So when someone tells you they've never been into sports, what they're often really saying is, my brain found its tribe somewhere else, and it found it first. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a neuroscience perspective. Sports fandom, at its core, is a dopamine experience. When your team scores, your brain releases dopamine. When they're about to win, your brain is flooded with anticipation chemicals. When they lose, you experience something surprisingly close to grief because your brain processed that outcome as personally meaningful. Researchers at the University of Utah actually found that testosterone levels in male fans fluctuate based on whether their team wins or loses, even when they're just watching on television. Think about that. The body responds to a game it's not physically playing. That is how deeply the brain can fuse identity with a team. But the brains of people who don't follow sports haven't switched off the dopamine system. That would be impossible. What's happened instead is that those same neurological reward circuits have been channeled somewhere else entirely. For one person, it's the stock market. For another, it's competitive cooking. For another, it's following a book series so obsessively that they've built spreadsheets tracking character arcs. The mechanism is identical. The object of obsession is just different. And this is something that gets missed constantly in conversations about sports culture. The question isn't whether someone has the capacity for passionate, tribal, emotionally charged engagement with something external. Everyone does. The question is simply, what did that capacity get attached to? Psychologists who study this distinction often point to something called the openness to experience trait, one of the core dimensions of personality in what's known as the Big Five model. People who score high in this trait tend to be drawn to complexity, novelty, abstraction, and aesthetic experience. They often find deep satisfaction in things that require interpretation, things that don't have a definitive score at the end. A symphony doesn't have a winner. A novel doesn't have a leaderboard. a philosophical debate, a painting, a piece of code that finally works. These things scratch a different itch than the clean binary of win or lose. And interestingly, research consistently shows that people high in openness are less likely to be avid sports fans, not because they're cold or unfeeling, but because their brains are oriented toward ambiguity rather than resolution. The uncertainty of sports is thrilling to some brains and genuinely uninteresting to others, and that difference is a personality trait, not a character flaw. But let's be honest about something that often goes unspoken. There's a social cost to not caring about sports, and it's worth acknowledging because millions of people feel it quietly every single day. In many cultures, and especially among men, sports literacy is a form of social currency. Knowing the scores, having opinions about the coach's decisions, being able to reference last night's game, these are the small rituals of belonging. They're the equivalent of a secret handshake. And when you don't have that vocabulary, social situations can feel like walking into a party where everyone is speaking a language you never learned. You can smile and nod, you can learn a few phrases, but there's always a slight distance, a sense of being adjacent to the group rather than inside it. What's psychologically fascinating is how people who don't follow sports navigate this social gap. Some develop what researchers might call a compensatory social script, basically a set of practiced responses that allow them to participate in the surface ritual of sports conversation without actually engaging with the content. Yeah, tough game. They've really been struggling this season. I think they need a new strategy. These are the verbal equivalents of nodding at a joke you didn't hear clearly. And the interesting thing is most sports fans don't actually notice, because what they're really craving isn't your genuine opinion about the linebacker's performance. What they're craving is connection, shared excitement, the feeling that you're in this together. And that need, the need for shared emotional experience, is something non-sports people understand deeply. They just access it through different doors. There's also a fascinating body of research around what psychologists call autonomy orientation, the degree to which a person is motivated by internally chosen goals versus externally validated ones. People with high autonomy orientation tend to find mass enthusiasm a little bit suspicious, not in a cynical way, but in a genuine psychological way. When millions of people are told to care about something, the autonomy-oriented brain instinctively asks, but do I actually care about this? Is this my feeling or a feeling I inherited? And that question, which sounds philosophical, is actually deeply rooted in how certain nervous systems are wired. Some brains are more sensitive to the difference between authentic internal states and socially performed ones. They find it genuinely uncomfortable to manufacture enthusiasm they don't feel. And sports, because of how culturally omnipresent it is, becomes a very visible test of that discomfort.
Here's a thought experiment that might land for you. Think about the last time you were completely absorbed in something. Not just mildly interested, absorbed. Where time dissolved, where you forgot to eat, where someone called your name and you genuinely didn't hear it because your whole brain was somewhere else. That experience, whatever caused it for you, is the neurological equivalent of what sports fans feel during a playoff game. Your brain was doing the exact same thing, releasing the same chemicals, engaging the same deep attention networks. The only difference is the trigger. And that tells you something important. The capacity for total immersion is universal. What varies is the key that unlocks it. This matters because it reframes the entire conversation. People who don't follow sports aren't less passionate. They're not less tribal. They're not less capable of loyalty or belonging or the particular joy of shared obsession. They've simply located their version of those experiences in less culturally visible places. In a fandom for a TV show that only 5,000 people in the world love with the same intensity. In a community of amateur astronomers who stay up until 3 a.m. to catch a planetary alignment. In competitive chess, fermentation hobbyist groups, vintage film communities, tabletop roleplay. These things don't have stadiums, they don't have halftime shows, but the human experience inside them is structurally identical to what happens in a sports bar on game night. Same dopamine, same belonging, same heartbreak when your thing lets you down. There's one more angle here that I think is worth sitting with, because it touches something genuinely philosophical about how we define community and meaning. Sports, at its best, does something remarkable. It gives strangers a reason to care about the same thing at the same time. It creates what sociologists call collective effervescence, that electric feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, of your individual identity briefly dissolving into a shared experience. Emile Durkheim, the sociologist who coined that term over 100 years ago, argued that humans need this experience. We need to feel connected to something beyond our private selves. And for much of human history, that need was met by religion, ritual, community celebration. In many modern secular societies, sports has stepped into that role. It is one of the last remaining institutions that can fill a stadium with 60,000 people who all feel in that moment like one organism. And people who don't connect with sports are not exempt from that need. They feel it too. They simply haven't found a stadium yet, or they've found smaller, quieter versions of it that don't get televised. And maybe, if we're being honest, some of them are still searching, still looking for the thing that will make them feel what those fans feel when the final whistle blows and their team wins. That restless searching, that quiet sense of being on the outside of an intensity you understand intellectually but can't quite feel viscerally. That is its own kind of emotional experience worth honoring. So, if you're someone who has spent years feeling vaguely out of step with sports culture, here's what the psychology actually says about you. Your brain is not broken. Your capacity for passion was simply routed differently. And if you've already found the thing that gives you your version of collective effervescence, your thing, the one that makes you lose track of time and forget to eat and talk too fast because you're so excited, then you already know exactly what sports fans are feeling. You just happen to feel it about something that doesn't have a scoreboard. And honestly, that might be the most interesting kind of fan there is. If this video made you think of someone who fits this description, share it with them. And if it made you think of yourself, drop a comment below. Tell me what your sport actually is, because I guarantee it's something worth talking about.